Ludwig van Beethoven was a revolutionary man of his day. He was the key which opened the door to the Romantic era of music, closing the door on the Classical era behind him. Unlike composers such as Mozart and Haydn before him, Beethoven composed his music out of his own passion, from what was truly in his heart and what he was inspired by, not for the purpose of making money. Although Beethoven had the opportunity to study with both Mozart and Haydn, he gradually separated himself from the musical style of which they were bound. Beethoven, first and foremost, is known for his originality at a time where that was not generally accepted. All he wanted to do was improvise melodies and play chords that were considered ungodly by contemporaries of his day. Music by earlier composers like Mozart and Haydn was created solely for the entertainment of kings and queens. Beethoven, however, wrote his own stories, music that represented what was to become of himself as well as society. Perhaps it is Beethoven's use of repetition that makes his music so memorable and appealing to listeners. His Fifth Symphony, for example, is based off of 3 of the same note and then 1 different note. He also gives many different variations on a single melody in his pieces, like the Ode to Joy, his Ninth Symphony, and his piano sonatas with the use of subtle changes. Beethoven cherished Napoleon Bonaparte as a leader and representative of the common people. However, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Beethoven felt so betrayed and was enraged by Napoleon's lies.
What's interesting about the Third Symphony, it was going to be called the Napoleon Symphony. And then he found out that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, put his crown on his head. People who are staying in power too long and taking advantage of the people, putting themselves first, and you know, this is communism in the last century. So Beethoven scratched out Napoleon's name so hard with his pen that he ripped the score. He dug a hole in the pages because he was angry that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, and above it, instead of Napoleon Symphony, he entitled it the Heroic Symphony, the Heroic Symphony.
When Beethoven was 6 or 7 years old, he suffered a mysterious illness, a horrible form of tinnitus. Although he recovered, he continued complaining about his ears. He would hear ringing and roaring sounds that made it increasingly difficult for him to hear. This caused him to go through serious depression and to force himself into isolation from the outside world. There was a time when Beethoven contemplated suicide, but would not go through with it as he felt he had much more music in his heart and mind that he needed to write down. Perhaps it is Beethoven's struggle with his deafness that caused him to experiment with different musical sounds that were not used by any other composers in his day. Beethoven influenced many others, including famous composers during as well as after his time, such as Karl Czerny, Franz Liszt, and Ferdinand Ries, to name a few. His student Ferdinand Ries had said,
"When all left out, something in a passage, a note or a skip, which in many cases he wished to have specially emphasized. Or, if I struck a wrong key, he seldom said anything. Yet when I was at fault with regard to the expression, the crescendi or matters of that kind, or in the character of the piece, he would grow very angry."
This showed that Beethoven didn't care much for the technicalities of music that were so emphasized during the classical era. Rather, emotion and expression were held of much higher importance to him.
And then he wrote the Pastoral Symphony, which became famous. You all know, everybody knows the Pastoral Symphony because it was in the movie Fantasia. And basically Walt Disney put Beethoven on the map here in Hollywood, and because you have now horses with wings flying in the air.
Beethoven also influenced artists like Van Gogh and Picasso, who used abstraction and cubism in their works to create a distinction from other artists in their days.
With his late string quartets, people were like, this guy, you know, he's going deaf, but I think it was more than that. He was a modernist, and he constantly sought to write something new. And I think that's inspiring not only for musicians today and people like bands like the Beatles, who revolutionized rock and roll, or like Elvis Presley. I think jazz and all sorts of music that are being new styles today, whether it be hip hop or rap. People are always looking to write something new, and I think we have to look back to Beethoven for that source of inspiration.
Ludwig van Beethoven died at the age of 57 on March 26, 1827. The exact cause of his death is unknown, however, some believe that he succumbed to lead poisoning. He is currently buried in Vienna, Austria, where many people today pay their respects. Locks of his hair were cut by contemporaries who cherished him during his life, and some of those locks are still preserved today. The home he was born in Bonn, Germany, has been turned into a museum and is now open to the public. The third largest crater on the planet Mercury was named in honor of Beethoven. Beethoven was without a doubt a leader during his life and is still considered a legend today, centuries later. He is probably not the first person anyone would think of when asked to name a leader, but he was no doubt a leader as he did revolutionize music. He began the Romantic era following the Classical era and influenced many composers who followed him, and even artists and architects, as they use his styles of repetition and add new styles to their works. Beethoven's music is also included in modern songs like Road to Joy by Bright Eyes, Memory by Savatage, This Night by Billy Joel, and many more. Ludwig van Beethoven is still one of the most influential people today, not just in art and in music, but also in the appreciation for individuality and originality in all aspects of life.